Good morning, everyone. For those of you who weren't here last night, I just wanted to give a brief introduction. My name is Sister Mary Margaret Hope. I'm here with Sister Fidelity Grace. We're members of a religious community founded about 35 years ago in New York City called the Sisters of Life, and we were founded to protect and enhance the sacredness of all human life, to proclaim the goodness of every person, their irreplaceable value in the world, this world and the next. And our missions include service to pregnant women and their children, a company of women seeking healing after abortion, hosting retreats, helping young people recognize their own goodness, and proclaiming the dignity of life from beginning until its natural end. So that's who we are. But the title of the talk that I was given is, "Who do you say that I am?" And I have to admit, when I hear this question, I get a very ridiculous song stuck in my head, not our beautiful theme song, but a different one. It goes back to this moment. I don't know if I can really convey to you what it was like. I think you might have had to be there, but I'm going to try my best. But it was a few years back, and the sisters had gathered for this community time, and we decided to have like a coffee house talent show sort of thing. And this group of older sisters decided that they were going to write a rap, or their version of a rap. Anyway. So they had sunglasses and this electric keyboard and really serious. And then they wrote this scripturally inspired song, and it went something like this. "Who do you say I am? I am. Who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? I am. Who do you say I am?" It just went on and on like that. So I have to admit, that's what's in my head right now. I hope it won't be in your head now for the rest of the day. But do you ever wonder why Jesus asked his disciples this question? I mean, why didn't he just tell them, "I'm the incarnate Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the Messiah"? Was it like a factual test? No, it wasn't really about facts at all. He didn't even want to know how he was perceived by the world, what his image was. The real issue wasn't about even his objective identity, the fact that he had a divine and a human nature. What he wanted to know was what was the place that he held in the hearts of his disciples. Who do you say that I am? We spoke last night about names and how a name identifies not what you are, but who you are, your vocation, your unique place in the heart of God. It's why identity is not just something we construct, the image that we project to the world. It's something that's given to us in the relationships that define our place in God's plan. And ultimately, our relation to God is the most defining relationship in our life. It's what roots us in the truth of who we are. That's why we want to kind of turn the tables and ask Jesus, "Who do you say that I am?" Remember, not what do you say that I am? A good person, a sinner, a failure, a success. But who? Who do you say that I am? St. John Paul II said, "We are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of his Son, Jesus." And I think this question, who am I? It arises at different stages, maybe key stages in our life. I look out at this church, I see a lot of beautiful women of God. I see many young women here, maybe you're seeking the way that God is calling you to make a total gift of yourself through marriage or consecrated life. Maybe you're looking for your professional calling, the contribution that God wants you to make to the world. And I see married women here who maybe are experiencing a particular struggle with your vocation at this time. There comes a time in life when those things that always defined us, they can start to crumble, lose their meaning in our lives. Maybe things haven't quite turned out the way that you expected they would. Maybe you're carrying the cross of infertility, or there's problems in your marriage or with your family. And I see older women here too. Maybe you're at a crossroads of a new stage in life. Maybe your children have recently grown and moved out, or if you've retired, or health struggles have narrowed your world. And these are moments too when life can feel constraining, even meaningless. And I think these are all really important moments to ask Jesus this question again: who do you say that I am? And last night, Sister Fidelity Grace shared with you a bit about her own religious name and how she received it. So I thought I'll share with you too a little bit about my name. So my full religious name is Sister Mary Margaret Hope. I have 3 names because for each name, it represents for me kind of a particular aspect of my identity, of my vocation. And I think there are 3 aspects which all of us as women share. These are the identities of daughter, bride, and mother. So I'll begin with Margaret, because Margaret is the name that I received from my parents at my baptism when I became an adopted child of God. So it captures my identity as daughter, and so it's remained at the center of my religious name. And the essence of being a daughter is receiving yourself from another. In New York City, we have a mission to pregnant women, and we work with a neonatologist. Her name is Dr. Paravicini. She's an expert in taking care of sick babies, and she's part of a team of doctors who deal with high-risk pregnancies. And her team would regularly meet to discuss difficult cases, and unfortunately, the answer to these hard situations always seemed to be the same: abortion. But Dr. Paravicini, she really advocated for the lives of these vulnerable children. And one day, she was presented with a particularly challenging case. It was a teenage mother and her teenage boyfriend, and they were pregnant with conjoined twins. And the 2 girls were attached at the heart. They had one heart between the 2 of them, and everyone knew there was no way they could survive for long after birth. But Dr. Paravicini agreed to support these young parents in their desire to give their little girls a chance for life, even if it was only for a brief time. So you can imagine what it looked like on the day of the delivery room. You know, it was crammed with all these doctors and med students. Everyone wanted to witness kind of this freakish occurrence, Siamese twins being born. People were making really awful comments like, why did they let things go this far? Why didn't someone take care of this earlier? But the moment that those little babies were born, all the murmuring hushed. There was silence in that OR because little Keela and Kayla were born embracing each other, with their arms wrapped around each other. And that young father, who you might recall was almost a child himself, he received his barely breathing daughters into his hands, and he said to them, "Don't be afraid. Daddy's here." There was a hush in that room because everyone saw the beauty of that moment. There was no question that no matter how long Keela and Kayla were in this world, their lives were a gift. And Dr. Paravicini asked the young father if he wanted her to baptize his children, and he said yes. So she began to make the sign of the cross on one of the babies. "I baptize you, Keela." And the father grabbed her hand and said, No, that's Kayla. This is Keela." And why did the name of that little baby matter so much to her father? She wasn't going to live long enough to become famous or even long enough to learn to recognize her own name. But the gaze of that teenage father was like the gaze of God the Father upon each one of us here. He delighted in the unique gift of his baby girls. He saw the purpose of even their short lives. And Kayla received the gift of her life just by living. She had an identity, even in those few breaths that she took. She was loved by her father. She was Kayla, and her life had meaning. That's what it means to live as a daughter of God, to know that your life is a gift, that the Father knows you intimately. He's pleased with you. He delights in you, and no one could ever be mistaken for you or replace you in his eyes. You're loved, and your life is a gift, however it unfolds, whether it's long or short, easy or difficult. It's a gift. Now, receptivity, like receiving a gift, it's often thought of particularly as a feminine virtue, right? Actually, we have physical spaces inside of us that are literally designed to receive another little person. And this capacity to receive is described by St. John Paul II as one of the most prominent aspects of the feminine genius. But in our modern culture, I think sometimes receptivity is seen as a weakness because we tend to prize action, initiative, independence, self-sufficiency. We see these as the highest virtues. We've seen the feminist movement kind of rebel against this idea of women as passive, helpless doormats, playthings, or worthless servants. But that's not what being receptive means. Receptivity is actually fundamental to every human person, male or female, because none of us is our own origin. We're all created. We receive our being from our parents and ultimately from God. Even as material beings with bodies, we're kind of hopelessly dependent. Every moment we need air to breathe. We need to eat. Even all our knowledge comes from outside of us. We receive it through our senses. We can't even come to know ourselves without receiving that from another. If you think about this, how does a child awaken to a sense of self? What's that first incipient sign of consciousness in a little baby? It's a smile. The child, seeing his mother smile at him, recognizes that he's somebody good, someone who's valued. It's from her smile that he learns that he's someone at all. He knows himself to be a someone who's lovable and is loved. And a mother will smile at her baby for weeks before the baby ever responds. But the moment when the baby really receives that truth, knows his own goodness in whatever way little babies can know that, what does he do? He smiles back. His first spontaneous action is a smile. Because receiving is not purely passive. To truly receive a gift is to make it your own. A gift that sits unused, unopened, it was never really received, never really welcomed. But the child receives the gift of his own self by living from that self, by taking his first intentional act, by smiling. That's what being a daughter means. It doesn't just mean being dependent on another, but being empowered by another to be yourself. And what's even more, receptivity, it's not just a creaturely attribute. Do you know who the archetype of all receptivity is? It's the divine Son of God. Jesus' identity as a divine person in the Trinity is to be Son, the one who receives his divine essence from the Father. So if God himself is receptive, then it can't be a deficiency. It has to be a strength. It's a perfection. So being dependent, receiving your life, is what gives you the freedom to be, to live from that gift, instead of having to earn your worth by your own achievements. And that's really what the name Margaret reminds me of. Margaret comes from the Greek word margarita, which means pearl. And the founder of our community, who was Archbishop of New York, Cardinal O'Connor, he used to say that we need to see ourselves as the pearl of great price, the pearl that our Lord assured us was worth selling everything to acquire. I mean, how is it that my soul was worth the Son of God emptying himself of his divine glory, coming down to earth, dying on the cross to save it? Not because of anything I've ever done or could do for him, but because he loves me. My value is a gift that I receive. It's not something that I can earn. So I've been a precious pearl from the very first moment of my existence, and nothing can ever change that. Does that mean I should just sit in my oyster and shimmer? No. God gave me my life to live it, and receiving always means living out of the gift. But sometimes I think we forget, Rika was mentioning this too, that living, that being, is actually an activity too. In fact, it's the most important activity. The most important activity of all is just to be. Now, last year when my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, she accepted it with great peace and serenity, and she embraced all the pain and suffering that she was going to have to endure. But as a side effect of the cancer, she suffered a debilitating stroke. And unexpectedly, she was no longer able to move or speak clearly. I could see what a great frustration this was, because my mother had always been a doer. You know, she was the one actively helping others, taking care of people. And now there were all these things that she meant to do, and she had to leave them undone. And worse, now she was totally dependent. She needed other people to wash her, to feed her. And in a moment of discouragement, she said to me, what's the point of my still being here? I can't do anything. What good am I? Why doesn't God just take me home? And I think it's an understandable feeling. I mean, we don't like to be dependent. We don't like to feel useless. You know, we're in this action-focused culture where being just doesn't seem like enough. But the truth is, my mother was a gift to me, not in spite of her vulnerability, but because of it. Because I was able to feed her and wash her and love her in her weakness and need, her gift to me was to receive my love by just being. And I think this is the truth, that the prevalence of MAID here in Canada, it really obscures this, that being itself is good, that receiving is good, that it's a gift to the giver and not a burden. And my mother was still herself. She was still free, even if she was confined to bed and unable to think clearly. And even those tragic situations when a suffering individual doesn't have family and friends who love them and take care of them, even those people, they're still receiving love just by being, because their lives are a gift of love from the Father, from the Creator, who wants his gifts to be received, even in the midst of great suffering. And this is what living as a daughter means, to simply receive God's love, to live from that love. Because God doesn't hold back. That is a lie that the evil one told Eve in the garden, that God is keeping us from being free, from forcing us to remain dependent on him, somehow deprives us of being fully ourselves. And I think that's why we're always tempted to grasp for things, like Eve grasped for the fruit in Eden instead of just waiting for God to give it to her. But God doesn't hold out. He doesn't tease us only to tantalize us and pull back our freedom at the last minute. It's a real gift. He really lets it go. We are really free. We're not slaves. We are daughters of God. We really belong to ourselves. We can choose how we will respond at every moment, no matter how constrained we may be. Even someone who's so deeply compromised by illness that they're not able maybe to make fully rational decisions, she never fully loses her freedom in that situation. Her own beating heart, her own brain is still the source of her being in a certain sense, but not the ultimate source. The ultimate source is always God. And we are free because we're dependent, because we receive ourselves as a gift from God. And that's what it means to be a daughter of God. Now, the next aspect that I would like to share with you is related to the name Mary. Fun fact, Mary is the name shared by the majority of Jesus' first female disciples. Actually, no one's even really sure how many different Marys there were in the Gospels. We know that there was 3 Marys at the foot of the cross. There's Mary of Bethany and Mary of Magdalene. And of course, we know the Blessed Virgin Mary. But to me, when I think of the name Mary, it's the name of the bride, the name of the church, whom the Virgin Mary is the type and exemplar of. So for me, it's a very spousal name. And I think of that intimate moment when Jesus called Mary Magdalene by name in the garden, and suddenly she recognized his voice. And when I hear Jesus say that name, when he calls me Mary, I always imagine it being the way that he spoke her name on that glorious morning when he declared his union with the newborn church, a marriage that he had consummated on the cross. When he spoke that word, Mary, it was like the new Adam recognizing in sinful Eve, the new Eve, Mary, his mother. I don't think it's a coincidence that they had the same name. And every Christian, regardless of marital status, woman or even man, has a bridal identity as a member of the church. We are all Mary. And that means that at heart, we are virgin brides, every one of us. In our culture today, that's another thing that people don't appreciate, virginity. Like receptivity, it's often seen as a lack, a deficiency, something that has to be overcome. But the emptiness of the virginal heart is a capacity to receive. Virginity and marriage are not opposites. Virginity finds its fulfillment in marriage. And as strange as this might sound, I think that even in marriage, there's something like virginity, because we're all saving ourselves for the wedding feast of heaven. What do I mean by this? So just as the fidelity of all of you beautiful married women here are an image for us religious of what it means to be a bride, to be espoused to Christ, I think consecrated religious can also reveal something to married women about what it means to live as a member of the church. Cardinal Cantalamessa said that virginity liberates marriage and each of the partners from the unbearable weight of having to be everything for each other, of taking the place of God. Because being a Christian means that nothing in this world, not even being a husband or a wife, can ever completely define your identity. Because the first relationship, from which all other relationships flow, is our relationship with God. A beautiful example of this is the French mystic whose cause is open, Elisabeth Lisieux. She was married for 25 years to a fiercely anti-Catholic atheist. But she deeply loved her husband, Felix. Even though he often ridiculed her faith, tried to undermine it, she received him as he was, faults and all. She respected and cherished him. But she never gave up on him. Elizabeth knew that Felix had been entrusted to her, just as she was entrusted to him. And everything she suffered in her life, including the cross of infertility, which was a great one, she offered it for her husband, for his conversion. And she made a very bold prediction, which she wrote in a letter to her husband that he found after her death at the age of 48 from cancer. This is what she said: "I shall die before you, and when I'm dead, you will be converted. And when you are converted, you will become a religious. You will be Father Lazier." Now, her husband also found her diary after she died, and he read it. And he realized how patiently she had loved him all those years and the depth of her religious experiences. She offered her own self for his soul, that he would come to know God. That he did. He had a conversion, and 5 years after her death, he entered the Dominicans and was later ordained, just as she predicted. And he became the spiritual director of one of the greatest preachers in history, the soon-to-be beatified Fulton J. Sheen. Elizabeth loved her husband with her whole self. She was fully given to him, but she lived that bridal receptivity in a manner that wasn't passive or slavish, but true to herself, with a kind of virginal integrity, because she was always oriented to God, and that's how she was able to truly love her husband. And our vocation to be virgin brides, it's most completely lived out in these definitive commitments: marriage, consecrated life. But even for those of you out there that are still waiting to find Mr. Right, don't despair. Remember that even now, whatever your state in life is going to be in the end, you are a member of the bride of Christ. You belong completely to God. He has chosen you, wooed you. He will always be a faithful protector and provider for you. And he's even given his name to you. Do you know that? You are a Christian. You are Mrs. Christ. That is your identity. It is sealed at your baptism, and you don't need to wait to live out of that truth. So this one now brings me to the last part of my name, the one that I go by most often, which is hope. I love this poem by the French author Charles Péguy, in which he describes hope as a little girl. He says, "Faith is a loyal wife, and charity is a mother, an ardent mother, noble-hearted, or an older sister who's like a mother. But hope is a little girl, nothing at all." And in a sense, hope returns to that first relational identity, that of daughter, a little child. And when I first received the name, actually, it was in honor of my older sister, Hope Marie, who died when she was a little girl. And her life ended when she was only a week old, long before I was even born. Yet I've always felt a mysterious connection to Hope Marie. She was born far too early, at only 25 weeks. And when my mother was pregnant with my older brother, the same complication occurred, and he also was born very premature. And my mother prayed for a miracle, that he would survive. And at the time, she was given a relic of a little-known saint. Actually, she was only a blessed, Margaret of Castello. And she promised her that if my brother survived, and if she was ever blessed with another daughter, she'd name her Margaret in Thanksgiving. Probably guessed the other daughter is me. And I wish I had more time to talk to you about St. Margaret because I love her so much, and she has a lot to do with my vocation. But in brief, little Margaret, as she's often called, was born blind, and she grew up to be lame, hunchback, and small in stature. And she was rejected by her wealthy parents. First, she was locked in a tiny cell, then abandoned on the street. But even though she received so little love in the world, she never closed her heart. She was always open to receive love, and God filled it to the brim. She became a holy, joyful woman who'd limp around town with her little cane on missions of mercy to the poor and the sick. She was beloved of many, performed many miracles even in her lifetime. And her body, when she died at the age of 33, like Jesus, which had been judged defective by so many people, has been incorrupt for 700 years. She was canonized just 5 years ago by Pope Francis as one of the patron saints of the pro-life movement. She's the special patron of the unwanted. And even though she wasn't beloved by her earthly parents, little Margaret lived out of her identity as a beloved daughter of God. And that's why she was so fruitful, performing so many miracles, doing so much good. Because daughterhood is the source of every other feminine identity, including the identity of mother. And as I've lived now with my religious name for about 15 years, I've come to see that Hope is a little girl, but through her, I'm called to be a mother. And Hope is the name of the fruit that God wants me to bear in the world. Because that's the essence of motherhood. It's bearing fruit. And this aspect of our feminine hearts is not tied only to physical maternity. St. Edith Stein said, God combats evil through the power of a woman's maternal love, and this power exists independently of a woman's marital status, but is present simply by the fact that she is a woman. It is an extension of her very nature. Women were created to nurture life, to recognize, to foster every potential. One of our sisters told me about an experience she had with one of the single moms who lived with us at our convent in Manhattan. And our guest was drying off the feet of her little 3-month baby girl, and she grabbed a bottle of baby oil, and she was massaging the little feet with the oil. And she was saying, I do this every night. I massage her little feet. I start with the toes, and I go all the way up. And she was spending, a long time on every little toe. And it's just like, really, you do this every night? Don't you think you're spoiling her? Mom stopped, looked at her, totally serious. She works hard all day. She's 3 months old, and she's in spit-up mode. The baby works hard? And the mother said, yes, she's very active. She tries to stand. She works really hard. And then she turned back to massaging this little baby's feet. Sometimes I think about this story when I've had a really hard day. And I picture the Blessed Mother looking me with this tender look of love and saying, you're really doing great. You tried to stand today. That's how mothers see things. And that is why motherhood is so needed in today's world. So thank you to all of you mothers who are out there today for all that you do to bring life into the world. And this desire for motherhood, it's deep in the heart of every woman. And it's part of who we are. And I think that's why abortion leaves such deep scars, because it attacks one of the most profound parts of women's hearts. And after having suffered an abortion, one woman told us her whole soul hurt. And this suffering can last for years, but praise God, his mercy is without limit. A certain woman who had been carrying this guilt for years, she found a pamphlet at a church about our ministry of healing after abortion. She quickly put it in her purse so no one would see it. She'd become so accustomed to living a life of shame and denial, but God wanted more for her. And it took her weeks to even look at that pamphlet. But finally, she found the courage to reach out. And while attending a retreat, she was able to finally let go of that shame and that guilt and receive God's love and mercy. She was made new again, able to receive her freedom, herself again from the Lord. And I pray that more and more women will come to know that healing after abortion is possible and how much God wants it for each one of us. But I also pray that more and more women are spared this terrible pain in the first place. The pro-choice movement has betrayed so many of us into believing that a child is something you can choose whether or not to generate. But a child is never a choice. A child is always a gift, to be received, but never demanded as a right. And I felt the Holy Spirit inspiring me to bring up an even more sensitive topic today, which is in vitro fertilization. And I think it's very likely that there are some here in this room who've undergone these fertility treatments or maybe are considering them. And I think probably every one of us knows somebody and loves them who was born of this technique or a similar one. And I don't mean this as a judgment or a condemnation of anyone. You may have never heard the church's teachings about these technologies. In fact, in my experience, very few Catholics have heard about it. And that's kind of why I felt the Lord asking me to share this truth with you today, even though it might be hard for some to hear. I think most people undergo IVF with very good intentions to give the gift of life. What could be a better reason? The desire to be parents is a sign of the richness of married love, of generosity of heart and spirit. And the cross of infertility, I think it's one of the most painful sufferings that a married couple can undergo. The Bible's filled with stories of this affliction and also with the hope that God can alleviate it with his miraculous power. And I also want to affirm that children who are born through these technologies, they're truly gifts. They're irreplaceable, infinite goods in this world. And we would never, ever say that it would be better if they would never existed. No, absolutely not. But the Catholic Church does teach that these methods of conceiving are not in accordance with the dignity of the human person. And even though God can always bring good out of evil, the end never justifies the means. You probably know that the clearest violation of the dignity of human life connected to IVF is the terrible fate of unused embryos who are destined for destruction or perpetual frozen stasis. But even for the fortunate ones, those who are born into a family that loves and cherishes them, even for them, IVF is problematic. Because a human person who has an immortal soul, personally infused by God himself, should never be the product of dehumanizing technology. Now, I've encountered many young people who were born through artificial means, and they're really grateful to know that they were so desperately wanted that their parents were willing to go through such a painful, expensive, emotionally draining procedure in order to give them life. But often they also struggle with their identity. You know, they ask, who am I? Am I a gift? Or am I a product commissioned to fill my parents' needs? Did God even want me to exist? And these feelings become especially complex in situations that involve donor sperms and eggs. And I think this confusion is a symptom of the disorder that's inherent in the means by which these young people were conceived. Because a human person is always meant to be the fruit of love, not a commodity. Children are the crown of marriage, and a marriage that's not open to children is not a true marriage. Acknowledging, of course, there's legitimate reasons to postpone having children, even indefinitely, through periodic continence. But, on the other hand, openness to life is not the same as reducing the marital embrace to just a means to the end of procreation. Because God didn't design human procreation as a technique, a carefully managed procedure. The couple is not the ones in control of the creation of life, because conceiving a child is a gratuitous gift that follows the act of love. So the really important part is not whether artificial means or natural means were used, but whether the child is conceived as an overflow of love or by human design. Technology, which is man's mastering of the natural world for his own ends, it's a great good, but it should never replace the marital embrace as the place of the conception of new life. This sacred realm of procreation, the origin of human life, immortal souls, it belongs to gift, not to manufacture. Now, let me repeat, I'm not suggesting that anyone who's undergone IVF did it out of bad intentions or selfishness. And there's many children who are conceived naturally, but in much less ideal circumstances, outside of marriage, even in rape, or whose parents fail to treat them as the gift that they are, according to their true dignity. And none of this diminishes the value of the child, even if his human origin wasn't in accordance with the dignity and the truth of the human person who was made for love and by love. But if any of you or anyone you know might be considering IVF, I wanted you to know the truth. because the truth will set you free. And the good news is that there's many legitimate ways medical technology can be used to heal the root causes of infertility without becoming the actual means of producing a human life. I'd encourage any woman who's suffering from infertility to look into NAPRO technology. I think you even have a fertility care center in Calgary that specializes in these treatments. And there's also many other ways for a marriage to be fruitful, through adoption or foster care, or the gift of radical hospitality. We know some beautiful married couples who've opened their homes to a pregnant woman with nowhere to go, or have taken in an elderly neighbor with no family. All of these are ways of living maternity and paternity in their deepest sense, the fruitfulness of love which builds up and nurtures another. In fact, I do have a small advertisement to make, which is that we're actually serving here in Calgary a mother who just had twins, and she is in need of a part-time nanny. And there is a grant that can pay for someone to be this nanny, but we're looking for someone who could perhaps fill this role. So if you know anyone who might be good at this, please come and talk to us in the break. End of advertisement. But I know that was kind of a lot to take in. So I'm going to return now to the main point of this section. In the gospel, Jesus asks another who question. Remember what it is? Who is my mother? And he answers it himself. Whoever does the will of my Father is my mother, my sister, and my brother. That's a very extraordinary statement. Jesus is offering us the opportunity to be his mother, to bring forth Christ into the world. But the only way that we can be the mother of God is by obedience to God's will. That's why the virtue of hope is not only important in living as a daughter of God, but it's the only way to truly become a mother. This posture of receptivity is the key to everything, just as it was in bridal love, because hope is not grasping or demanding, but an openness to receive. That's why there's an aspect of virginity even in motherhood. How do we know this? Because who is the exemplar of all motherhood? The Virgin Mother herself. Because virginity is both a readiness to receive and a readiness to let go. I think that's the significance of Mary's virginity before, during, and after the birth of Christ. Because not only was there empty space in Mary's womb to receive the word of God, but she was able to bring him forth without violence, to let him go with her whole self intact. And it was this same virginal motherhood that let him suffer and die for us when she stood at the foot of the cross. At that same moment, she received this unanticipated gift of the Apostle John, and she became the mother of the whole church. This is what virginal love is. It's pure, non-possessive love. It maintains a space to receive another, but doesn't seek to own him or her. It proceeds from a kind of contemplative outlook. This term, contemplative outlook, was introduced by St. John Paul II in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life. And he says that contemplative outlook is the outlook of those who do not presume to take possession of reality, but accept it as a gift. Receiving reality as a gift. That's really the whole point of this whole talk, if you want to take it away. This is how we're called to approach others in our maternal love, with reverence, ready to receive and nurture, but never to possess. Because every person is a gift for us to receive, but not to hold on to, not to gain mastery over. I remember receiving this kind of love from my mother. As a child, I would spend hours in the basement making art, as I called it. My mother would probably call it making a mess. But my mother rarely came down to see what I was doing. It probably was less stressful for her not to know. But I felt total freedom with my paper towel rolls and glue sticks and paint. And I always knew that if I brought her one of my creations, she would ooh and ah and hang it on the wall, and she would receive it, and me, and let me go back to my mess again. That was just, like a little example of virginal motherhood. But I know that many of you have had to let go of your children in much deeper, much harder ways, and had to watch them make much bigger messes out of their lives. In religious life, we aspire to be spiritual mothers. And at times, we can experience a similar temptation to that experienced by married women who maybe are suffering from infertility, or mothers who are suffering the pain of watching their children make bad decisions, especially watching their children leave the faith. There's times when we can feel discouraged. In those moments, we can want to seek emotional gratification that comes from having a nurturing relationship with those we serve, to be able to see the tangible fruits of our efforts. We want to possess spiritual children. But the gratification that comes from motherhood, both physical and spiritual, it's a gift. It's an overflow of its essence, but it's not its primary purpose. I actually didn't tell you my whole religious name. Like Sister Phility, I too have a title. And my title is Of the Morning Star. But as much as I love the stars, they have a very inconvenient aspect, which is that you can only see them at night. And just like the stars, hope shines most brightly in the midst of struggle and difficulties. Because hope doesn't mean pretending that suffering isn't there or that it's just going to go away. It's not the distorted optimism of rose-colored glasses that keeps us from living in reality. Hope actually means to have a deeper kind of vision that sees through the transient circumstances of our lives to the reality beneath. Hope-colored glasses, they don't allow us to see less, but more. They give us like a kind of X-ray vision that lets us see beyond this whole temporal world into eternity. Because to live in hope means to trust in God's goodness in the midst of darkness and struggle, receiving the gifts that don't always look like gifts, and waiting for the greatest gift of all, which is God himself. So when we ask this question, who do you say that I am? We recognize our identity, our very self, is a gift from another. The deepest parts of our identity are relational: daughter, bride, mother. And all of them depend on that very special feminine virtue of active receptivity. So when our dependency makes us feel like a burden, or we lose our orientation, or we feel empty or fruitless, we can look to Mary. Mary, she is the exemplar of living as a virgin bride and mother, not in successive stages in life, but as the source and origin of all our activities, both great and small. And these are the moments that we want to return to, at those times in our life when our identity is feeling fragmented, confused, those times of transition, those times of struggle. If we want to know who we are, we don't need to find ourselves, let alone create ourselves the way social media encourages us to do by curating the perfect image. What we need to do is learn to have this contemplative outlook, to receive reality as a gift, to receive who we are in relation to our Creator. I know this can sound kind of complicated, but it's actually very simple. And even though it's hard to live in practice, I want to leave you with a concrete image of what receptivity really looks like. And it's the example of a child, because children are really the ones that can see the deepest realities most clearly. It's an experience that one of our friends, Lauren, shared with us. She had begun to nanny for a family that had a 6-year-old daughter with severe autism. And this little girl, Maggie, her parents were Catholic, but they'd stopped going to Mass because Maggie just couldn't sit still. She'd throw a fit if they tried to bring her to church, and they just kind of got discouraged. But Lauren said, you know what? You go to Mass, I'll take care of Maggie, we'll sit in the back, you pray, it's going to be fine. So she did that. So Lauren brought Maggie, sat down in the back pew, and immediately she was kind of agitated. So Lauren took her hand and said, okay, what do you want, Maggie? And she walked her all the way up to the front of the sanctuary, And she sat down on the first step. And Maggie kind of looked at the priest and he said, sure, as long as she doesn't, make any noise, it's fine. So Maggie was quite happy to sit there on the first step. And when the music started at Mass, she looked around, but she didn't say anything until the moment of consecration. And at that moment, she started blowing kisses and saying, hi, hi. Now, here's the interesting thing. The particular form of autism that Maggie has, she's not able to initiate an interaction with another person. She can only respond. So if someone says, I love you, she responds and says, you too. And that's what Maggie was doing when the priest lifted up Jesus in the Eucharist. She said, hi, you too. So the priest knew he'd done it right. And she lifted up her hands as if somebody was hugging her. And this happens every time she goes to Mass. When the priest put the Eucharist back in the tabernacle, she said, bye-bye. And I think this is the reality that we don't see. The reality of the gift that Jesus is truly present with us at every moment. And he blows kisses at us. And he reaches out and embraces us. But Maggie wasn't distracted by all the things that consume our attention. So she was able to see deeper, to know who she is, a beloved daughter called to be fruitful, virginal, to live in union with Christ. So I want you to listen to this answer that Jesus gives when you ask him that all-important question, who do you say that I am? You are the beloved daughter of my Father, totally dependent but totally free to be yourself. You are a gift, a precious pearl, and never a burden. You are my beloved spouse, part of my virgin bride, the church. You belong in heaven with me, and you can never be completely defined by earthly realities. You are in this world, but you are not of it. And you are my beloved mother, my virgin mother, who stands at the foot of the cross and receives the gift of her fruitfulness in darkness and in hope. And you are mine. This is who you are. And this is who you will always be. And nothing can ever change that. God bless you.